I'd like to introduce Hayley Guyver. Sorry, I've mispronounced your name there. I just had a last minute panic. Giever, sorry, isn't it? Beg your pardon. Sorry, Hayley Giever, who's going to talk about using multimodal portfolios to promote a deeper engagement and widening participation. So we're very much looking forward to your talk, Hayley. Thanks for agreeing to this. I'll hand over to you. You're on mute. I'll just.
And now, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yep.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity to talk about an assessment method I use, which is multimodal portfolios, and to think about how it has the potential to promote deeper engagement and widening participation. So to give you a bit of context about the program that I'm talking about, I have to just see how this is. Okay, so to just give you a bit of background, the assessment forms part of a module that I run for the IOE, the Institute of Education, and the module is a first year BA education. The module is a module called Global London Contemporary Urban Education, Culture and Space. And it's one of the modules that students undertake as part of their BA education program at the Institute of Education. It's a 3-week intensive module that happens in term 3. And the aim of the module is to use London as a springboard to explore ways that contemporary cities are theorized, experienced, and understood. The module aims to encourage students to reflect on their place in cities as students and as urban citizens. And the module also aims to build understanding of the relationship between the university and the city. So being students in the city and being students as part of a university and looking at the bridge between the institution and the urban. And you can see from the table on the screen that each day of the module, we focus on a different theme around urbanism and around cityness. So this is the second year that I've run this particular module. And I thought it would be useful to use this conference as a space to reflect on the value of this type of assessment and also to build a more theoretical engagement around the kind of thinking around the methodology and outcomes of this type of assessment. This year we had about 70 students on the module, about 75, but in the end there were 70 that completed the module. They were a real mix of international students and home students, students that came from different parts, home students came from different parts of London. So there was a real mix in terms of different languages and cultures. And so I really wanted to use a type of assessment that could address the different needs and contexts that students come from. So the assessment at the end of the module asks students to reflect on all the themes that we covered over the module and to choose 4 or 5 themes, to think about the intersection of 4 or 5 of these themes and develop them into an overarching theme or an overarching question that would be a sort of driving framework for the portfolio. Students were expected to engage with the material that we from class, in other words, the lectures, the seminar periods, the portfolio work, which I'll talk about in a minute. We also went on field trips, and they were encouraged to really, after each day, to go and engage with the city, to think about how the city represents them. I seem to have missed a slide. Sorry, my mouse is not working properly. So to move around the city to develop a more coherent and reflective journal of their experiences of living and learning in London. And the final assessment was to develop a multimodal text to show the work that they've been doing throughout the module. So the rationale for using a multimodal portfolio was that it really enabled students, well, hopefully enabled students to engage with the complexities and the multi-layered modalities of cities and everyday processes. It also hopefully enabled students to represent and to reflect on the understandings that they were gathering through modes that they felt comfortable with. So students have phones, they're taking photos, they're using videos, they're using sound recordings, and so to really draw on the modes that they feel very comfortable using. But at the same time, also to create an opportunity for students to experiment with different modes of communication and meaning making. So to experiment with some modes that they might feel less comfortable with. It also aimed to provide a creative yet still academic form of literacy development that helps students understand the potentials of academic communication and meaning making. And it also aims to respond to and support students having different learning and literacy needs and processes. So thinking about the multilingual, the multicultural makeup of the group, to trying to respond to the different needs that students have to create a sense of inclusion and belonging, which is one of the aims of widening participation. So each day after lectures and seminar works, there was a certain amount of time set aside, 30 to 40 minutes each day, for students to do a little bit of work on their portfolios. Because it's such an intensive module and the submission date was quite close to the end of the module, they needed to engage every day with the kind of the themes that we were working with, but also what it meant for them and how they were going to represent it in their portfolios. So I'll just show you some examples of the daily portfolio work. So one of the things we worked around, for example, was the complexity of defining cities in contemporary times. We read some theory around this. We looked at some video work, and then when they left on the first day, they were encouraged to go around the city and to think about these complexities, these different ways that cities are defined, and to come up with some multimodal way of representing it through photos, through film, through sound recordings, through sight writing, through drawing, whichever mode they felt comfortable with. We also looked at, for example, the theme of architecture and the built environment. We looked at everyday architecture, but we also looked at iconic architecture. They spoke about architecture from their own context and brought in images from the internet to represent this. And then again, as they left for the day, they were encouraged to wander through the city and to think about how the built environment intercepts with their everyday life and to try and capture this multimodally. Another theme was, for example, the urban everyday, where they were asked to capture the day before we were talking about the urban everyday, they were asked to capture their understanding of the urban everyday multimodally. Then they came to class, we did some readings around how the everyday is theorized, and they spoke together about what the literature means, and then looked at their multimodal texts again and evaluated how their text spoke to the work that they had, what they had thought about initially, but also how their thoughts about the urban everyday might have changed because of the work that we had done in class. So this is just some of the examples of the daily work that we did throughout the module. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you some examples of students' work, and through doing that, I'm going to pull out what I think are the main ways, the main elements that really highlighted how students were engaged with the work that they were doing, that really came out in, and it was really reflected in the portfolios that they put together. So the first thing that really came out was a deeper sense of place. I saw evidence of students really engaging with the areas that they were living in, not only through exploring them, but also through thinking about the ways that they can capture, articulate, and represent them multimodally. And in this example, you see a student who's compared two different areas, built a comparative framework between Canary Wharf and Tower Hamlet, and developed a sense of how to compare these two different areas using themes from the module, but also really engaging with the sense of place, what is happening in these urban contexts. This is an example from another student who was living in Aldgate and developed a comparison between Aldgate and Aldgate East, and really started engaging with the impact of the student living in Aldgate and what they're bringing to that place. There was also a development of a sense of agency. So this is not just, this is really about students thinking about the contribution that they make to urban processes and practices. So thinking about what do they bring to cities, what do they contribute, what changes do they make, and what effect do these changes have, and what do they take away with them. And this is also the sense of agency as creators of meaning, realizing that the content that they were creating in these multimodal portfolios is valuable and contribute to knowledge production. And here you see an example of a student who's developed this this circular flow of income. So thinking about students and their spending patterns and their consumption patterns, as well as the university's spending and spending patterns. So they developed this flow chart around these sort of patterns. Another student who interrogated this term of students being an invisible population, argued against it by showing the statistics, how many students there were, but also about what that student brings in terms of their role as a student in the city and in the university, interrogating the notion of community and what parts they play, as the different communities they belong to, and what effect that has. And then students were also able to experiment with the affordances of different modalities. So a part of the motivation for using a multimodal portfolio was to move away from the dominant mode of writing, but to think about what other types of modalities can help you to express meaning. And we can see how students have used a range of modalities here, from sound recordings to tables to Google Maps, timetables, drawings, posters, and drew on these different types of modalities in their posters to create meaning. And then the expression of uniqueness. So students were not relying on the written mode, which they feel more comfortable with, but were really forced to create meaning through the range of modalities that they felt comfortable using. And this is not just through photos, simply photos and for example, recordings, but how you bring this together in terms of how do you design this form of representation. And so what we're seeing here is that each portfolio is an expression of the student's agency and their meaning making, and that having complete freedom in terms of design and creating content allowed the students to experiment and to express their own understanding of the module, but also of their place within the module. So these portfolios also allowed the students to understand different research methodologies and the value of empirical data. So during the module, we looked at different ways that the cities are theorized and understood and researched, and students were encouraged to think about research methodologies. And so here we see an example of a student who has mirrored a research approach by Susie Hall, who's a sociologist and an anthropologist, who walked the streets of Rye Lane in Peckham to understand the social and economic practices as a result of transnational urbanism. And we see the student taking on this type of methodology. The student analyzes the meaning of key concepts and then applies it to a context they're familiar with, together with explanation and elaboration. The student takes images of places and spaces to represent the concepts that they're unpacking and exploring, and then analyzes the relevance of these places and spaces in relation to the concepts they've been working with, and drawing out both local and global understandings, and then ultimately puts this all together into a multimodal portfolio. And so this deeper engagement really highlights students' active engagement with semiotic resources available to them at a particular moment in a specific social-cultural context. But it also really highlights the foregrounds, the principles of design and composition in these portfolios. And Besemir and Kress talk about design as the process of giving shape to the interest of the sign maker for an assumed audience using the available semiotic resources, and that these choices are always expressions of ideology and power. So I want to quickly move on to widening participation. So why do I think that these portfolios have the potential for widening participation? They have the potential to expand the boundaries of academic literacies, making them more inclusive. They help students to develop their voice through composition and design. They enable students to realize their power and agency in creating their own meaning. They allow students to experiment with more non-traditional academic genres. They harness students' representational and reflective skills and resources. And as Archer has highlighted in the introduction, these portfolios allow students to realize that they're not simply receivers of knowledge, but they're active in the making and production of meaning. They recognize students' experiences outside of the university, and Arlene also highlighted this earlier, their identities, their histories, their language, and their culture. And they prepare students to better navigate, understand, and critically evaluate the diverse multimodal world surrounding them as they constantly engage with the world. So while these are ideals around widening participation, the reality is that not all students produced this type of engagement or were able to respond to this task in the same way. And so I wanted to evaluate about how can this impact be made more meaningful? How can the impact of this type of assessment be more long-lasting? How can it be more meaningful for students? So I'm really evaluating on some of the things that I need to think about in terms of this type of assessment and the module. And the first thing, and that's why I was asking Arlene this question in the beginning, is it's important to have space and time to really engage with the theories and language around multimodality. It's not a language that is natural, and helping students to develop that type of language and vocabulary can really develop the potential for engaging with it, but also in terms of creating meaning. It would be useful to work towards co-creating a module, so co-creating the assessments, the criteria, and the daily portfolio tasks. And this is this meta language of recognition that I think Arlene was talking about, because it will help students to deepen their language around multimodality, to deepen their insight around multimodality, but also to think about the meta potentials of these types of methodologies. So multimodal portfolios are one type of assessment that really opens up a crack in terms of experimentation and empowerment. And for students, they're in their first year of their BA study, education studies, where most of their assessments are going to be written-based. They're going to be essays or presentation or text-based. So it would be useful to widen that crack in order for it to be more meaningful towards more non-traditional types of assessments and projects. And universities are definitely making that move towards using more non-traditional types of assessments. It would also be useful to be able to reflect on the process and the task after submission. So once the students have submitted, most of them go on holiday, and there's no space for reflecting with students about, how, what agency was built, what was their positionality, how did they understand their positionality in doing this type of task, what are the assumptions and values, and how were they transformed by doing this type of research, both in terms of the module, in terms of the institution, being a student in the university, but also about being an urban citizen in the city. And then also needing to think more about how to support students. So for the more confident students, these multimodal portfolios were really taken on with a lot of excitement and confidence. But there were also a lot of students who were less confident and had never done this type of task before, and so felt out of their comfort zone and sometimes felt quite scared and wanted to move and felt quite scared to move away from very typical essay type structures and essay type assessments. So it was also a way of thinking about how do you support those students that feel less comfortable, but also still supporting those that feel more comfortable in order to really develop the potentialities of those types of assessments. And I think that's the end of my presentation, just a reference list. And I'm going to stop sharing, so I have to remember how to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Hayley. That was fantastic. And my own background in urban geography, I love that idea of, and I was thinking about, you know, back to when we did our field trips and things that we got to do. So fantastic. But I won't dominate the floor, but I'll open it up to anybody else. Got any questions? If not, I'll come in with some later. So any questions? Oh, so yeah, Ruth got her hand up first.
Well, thank you very much. And I just want to say that's given me inspiration for changing the assessment of my, well, just adding something to the assessment of my students in Italy. I just wondered, how did you assess this? I mean, was the focus more on the multimodal aspect or the linguistic aspect? What were the most important you know, what were your criteria for assessing it?
So I had to use the criteria of the BA8 program, the IOE, the Institute of Education, but I adapted the criteria so that it fitted more around not just about writing, but about the integration of different types of texts.
Okay.
And so I worked with, I've just forgotten the organization at UCL, anyway, who work around assessments, and I readapted the typical criteria so that it fitted a multimodal assessment. I mean, students were still assessed around, you know, choices of themes and engaging with the literature and justifications and evaluation, but it wasn't just about in terms of written text, but how you know, which choices of images did you choose, and how did you justify that in relation to the themes we were exploring? How does the literature then support that? And then what is your own reflections? How do you feel about this, you know, your understanding about these